In this video we will explore the fascinating history of Great Britain. If you enjoy these videos, please feel free to leave a like and or subscribe. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Long before there were cities, long before there were kings or flags or names on maps, there was the land itself. Picture it as it once was a place of dense, ancient forest stretching in every direction, broken only by rivers that ran cold and clear, by wetlands shimmering in pale morning light, and by hills that rose gently from the earth as if the ground itself were breathing. This was Britain before Britain had a name, a place shaped not by human hands, but by time and water, and the slow, patient movement of ice. We begin, as all things must, at the very beginning. Around 10,000 years before the birth of Christ, perhaps a little more, the last great ice age was drawing to a close. For tens of thousands of years, enormous sheets of glacial ice had covered much of what were now called the British Isles, pressing down upon the rock with unimaginable weight, carving valleys, scouring hillsides, and leaving behind a landscape transformed almost beyond recognition. As the ice retreated northward, it did something else. Too, it melted, and all that meltwater had to go somewhere. The seas began to rise. For a time, Britain was not an island at all. It was connected to the European continent by a broad, flat plain of land, a place that archaeologists and geographers have since given the rather beautiful name of Doggerland. Across this plain, early humans and animals moved freely, following the herds, following the seasons, following some deep instinct toward warmth and food and shelter. Woolly mammoths grazed here. Great aurochs, the wild ancestors of our familiar cattle, moved in slow, heavy processions through the scrubland, and among them, small groups of human beings, dressed in fays, carrying tools of flint and bone, made their quiet way across a landscape that no human eye would ever see again. Slowly, over centuries, the water crept higher. Doggerland shrank. The rivers that had once drained quietly into the plain became the mouths of something larger, the beginnings of what were now called the English Channel and the North Sea. And somewhere around 6,000 or 7,000 years before Christ, the last land bridge slipped beneath the waves, and Britain became an island. It was a transformation that would shape everything that followed. The people who remained on this newly formed island were the descendants of those earliest wanderers and hunter-gatherers of the Mesolithic period, the Middle Stone Age. They lived lightly on the land, moving with the rhythms of the natural world rather than imposing their own. They fished the rivers and coastlines, hunted deer and boar in the forests, gathered nuts and berries and roots as the seasons turned. They left behind very little, a few tools, a few middens of discarded shells and bones, the faint ghosts of hearths where fires once burned against the dark. But they were here. They knew this land. They had names for its rivers and its hills, names that are now entirely lost to us, swallowed by time as completely as Doggerland was swallowed by the sea. Around 4,000 years before Christ, something began to change. New people arrived by boat now, across the waters that had once been land, bringing with them new ideas, new tools, and a new way of living. These were the first farmers. They carried seeds and livestock, cleared patches of forest with stone axes, and settled in one place long enough to plant, and tend, and harvest. This was the Neolithic Revolution, the New Stone Age, and its arrival in Britain marks one of the most profound shifts in the entire history of these islands. For the first time, people were no longer entirely at the mercy of the wild world around them. They were shaping it, and they were building. The Neolithic people of Britain left behind monuments that still stand today, structures so large and so carefully crafted that they feel almost impossible, given the tools available to their makers. Long barrows rose from the landscape, great earthen mounds covering chambers of stone, where the dead were laid to rest and, perhaps, where the living came to commune with something beyond the ordinary world. Causewayed enclosures were dug from the earth's circular ditches and banks whose purpose remains mysterious, though they seem to have been places of gathering, of ceremony, perhaps of seasonal feasting and trade. And then there were the hens. Across Britain, Neolithic and later Bronze Age peoples raised extraordinary circular monuments, rings of standing stones, rings of timber posts, rings of earth and chalk. Most famous among them, of course, is Stonehenge, standing on Salisbury Plain in what is now Wiltshire. Its great sarsen stones hold from Marlborough down some 25 miles away, its smaller bluestones carried somehow, impossibly all the way from the Preseli Hills in southwest Wales, a journey of well over 200 miles. How they did it, we still cannot say with certainty. No written records survive. No blueprints, no instructions, no accounts of the labor or the years it must have taken. What we have is only the monument itself, a patient, enormous, enduring standing in the wind and the rain of the Wiltshire Plain as it has stood for more than 4,000 years. Whatever Stonehenge was for, and scholars have debated this for centuries, proposing everything from astronomical observatory to place of healing to ceremonial burial ground, it speaks to something important about the people who built it. They were organized. They had leaders capable of directing vast communal effort. They had beliefs complex enough to demand such extraordinary expression. They were, in every meaningful sense of the word, civilized. Around 2,000 years before Christ, the Bronze Age arrived in Britain. New peoples, new technologies, new ways of understanding the world drifted across the waters from the continent. Copper and tin were smelted together to create bronze harder, more durable, more useful than anything stone alone could offer. Tools and weapons changed. Trade networks expanded, stretching across Europe and beyond. Amber from the Baltic, gold from Ireland, ideas from everywhere. The landscape continued to be shaped by human hands. Field systems were laid out across the countryside, the ancestors, in some ways, of the patchwork fields that still define so much of the British landscape today. Round barrows, the burial mounds of Bronze Age chieftains and elites, dotted the hilltops in their thousands, many of them still visible if you know where to look. Life was still largely agricultural, still deeply tied to the rhythms of the seasons and the movements of the sun and moon, but it was growing more complex, more layered, more recognizably like what we might call society. And then, around 800 years before Christ, something new arrived once more. Iron. The Iron Age transformed Britain as surely as the coming of farming had. Iron ore was far more plentiful than the copper and tin needed for bronze, which meant that iron tools and weapons became available not just to the wealthy and powerful, but gradually to almost everyone. Agriculture became more productive. Populations grew. And as populations grew, competition for land and resources grew with it. It was in this context that one of the most iconic features of Iron Age Britain emerged, the hill fort. Across the British landscape, communities began to fortify the tops of hills, encircling them with rings of earthen ramparts and timber palisades, creating defensible settlements that could shelter people and livestock in times of conflict. Some of these hill forts were small and simple. Others were enormous, home to hundreds or even thousands of people from proto-urban centers. In a way, the closest thing Britain had yet seen to towns. Maiden Castle in Dorset is perhaps the most breathtaking of them. A vast complex of ditches and ramparts covering more than 4 to 5 acres, its defenses so elaborate and so formidable that even today, walking its outer banks, it is difficult not to feel a faint sense of awe. People lived here, worked here, traded here. Children were born inside these earthworks and grew old within sight of the same hills. It was a world at once recognizably human and utterly foreign to our own. The people of Iron Age Britain were, of course, the Celts, or at least, that is how they have long been known. The term is somewhat imprecise, and modern scholars are cautious about applying it too broadly, but it captures something real, a family of related cultures, languages, and artistic traditions that stretched across much of Europe during this period, from Anatolia in the east to Ireland in the far west. In Britain, Celtic languages were spoken by the ancestors of Welsh, Cornish, Breton, Scottish Gaelic, and Irish. Celtic art flourished, producing some of the most beautiful metalwork ever made in these islands, swirling, abstract, endlessly intricate patterns that seem to move even when the metal is still. Celtic society in Britain was organized into tribes, each with its own territory, its own king or queen, its own gods and rituals and stories. Druids, a priestly class of scholars, judges, and spiritual intermediaries, held enormous authority. They memorized vast bodies of oral knowledge, conducted religious ceremonies, and mediated disputes between the living and, it was believed, between the living and the dead. They did not write their knowledge down. It was too sacred, perhaps, or simply too dangerous to commit to any sophist that might be read by the wrong eyes. And so their wisdom, whatever it was, is largely lost to us. What remains is beautiful and strange, and speaks of a world alive with meaning, a world in which every river had a spirit, every grove of trees a god, every turning of the year reason for ceremony and fire and song. This was Britain on the eve of recorded history, a green and ancient island, populated by Iron Age farmers and warriors, organized into tribal kingdoms, rich in belief in art and oral tradition. Not the wild, barbaric place that later writers would sometimes imagine it to be, but a fully formed, complex, deeply human world. And soon, that world would change forever. From across the sea to the south, a new power was watching. An empire unlike anything these islands had yet encountered was extending its reach further and further across the known world. Its soldiers marched in organized formations across the deserts of Africa and the forests of Gaul. Its engineers built roads that stretched for thousands of miles. Its administrators imposed a single language, a single law, a single vision of what civilization could mean. Rome was coming. But that story, the story of conquest, resistance, and the long shadow that 4 centuries of Roman rule would cast across everything that followed, that is a story for the next part of our journey. For now, let the ancient land rest. Let the wind move through the grasses around Stonehenge, as it has moved for 4,000 years. Let the rivers run cold and dark through the forests. Let the fires in the hillforts burn low against the night. Britain is waiting. In the year 55 before Christ, a man stood on the northern coast of Gaul, the land we now call France, and looked out across a gray, choppy stretch of water toward a distant white line on the horizon. The cliffs of Britain. The man was Gaius Julius Caesar, the greatest general of the Roman world, and he had already conquered most of what he surveyed. Behind him lay Gaul, subdued after years of brutal warfare. Ahead lay an island that Rome had heard of, traded with, even but never truly known. An island of mystery and rumor, said to be rich in tin, in grain, in pearls. An island whose people had been sending aid and shelter to Rome's enemies on the continent. An island, Caesar decided, that it was time to visit. He assembled his ships. He gave his orders. And Rome came to Britain for the first time. It was not, by any military measure, a triumph. Caesar crossed the Channel twice in 55 BC and again in 54 BC with substantial forces, pushing inland, fighting several engagements against the tribes of southeast Britain, and extracting promises of tribute and submission from a number of local kings. But he did not stay. He did not build forts or roads or towns. He did not leave a garrison behind. When autumn came and the season of campaigning drew to a close, he withdrew back to Gaul, and Britain slipped back into its own affairs as if Rome had been nothing more than a passing storm. For nearly a century, it remained that way. Rome was distracted by civil wars, by the assassination of Caesar himself, by the long and painful birth of the empire under Augustus and his successors. Britain was watched from a distance, traded with, occasionally threatened, but not invaded. Some British kings even cultivated friendly relationships with Rome, sending embassies, receiving Roman goods, adopting Roman fashions and titles. A kind of soft influence crept across the southern part of the island even without a single Roman soldier setting permanent foot on its soil. But in the year 43 after Christ, everything changed. The Emperor Claudius needed a victory. He was, by the standards of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, an unlikely emperor, bookish, physically unimpressive, prone to stammering, regarded by his own family as something of an embarrassment. He had come to power not by design but by accident, lifted onto the throne by the Praetorian Guard after the murder of the deeply unstable Caligula. His authority was uncertain, his reputation was fragile, and a military triumph, a real one, visible and undeniable, was exactly what he needed to secure his position. Britain was the answer. A pretext presented itself conveniently, as pretexts often do. A British king named Verica, ruler of a tribe in the south of the island, had been overthrown by his neighbors and came to Rome seeking help. Claudius had his justification. He assembled an invasion force of around 40,000 soldiers, 4 legions plus auxiliary troops under the command of a capable general named Aulus Plautius, and sent them north across the Channel. The invasion of AD 43 was the real thing. The Roman army landed on the Kent coast and began to push inland almost immediately. What followed was not a simple walkover. The tribes of southern Britain were experienced fighters, fiercely independent, and in some cases formidable opponents, but the Roman military machine was something against which nothing in Britain had any adequate answer. The legions were disciplined in a way that Iron Age warriors simply were not. They fought together, in formation, behind large rectangular shields, their movements coordinated by officers whose commands cut through the chaos of battle with practiced precision. They built camps every single night, proper fortified camps with ditches and ramparts and gates ensuring that they never slept without protection. They had artillery, siege equipment, supply chains, engineers. They were not just soldiers but an entire system of organized violence, and that system ground steadily northward and westward through the British landscape. 2 brothers led the main British resistance in the southeast, Caratacus and Togodumnus, sons of the powerful King Cunobelinus, whose kingdom had dominated much of southeast Britain for decades. Togodumnus was killed in the early fighting. Caratacus escaped, and his story would continue, but for now, the southeast was falling. The Romans reached the River Thames. They crossed it, and then they paused, and waited, because Claudius himself was coming. The emperor arrived in Britain with elephants. Elephants probably wore elephants, brought to impress and terrify, marching through the forests and farmlands of southern Britain toward the tribal capital of Camulodunum, the place we now call Colchester. Claudius stayed for just 16 days. He received the surrender of 11 British kings. He presided over the formal ceremonies of conquest with all the theater that Rome could command. And then he went home, leaving Aulus Plautius to get on with the actual work of subduing the rest of the island. It was work that would take the better part of 40 years. The legions fanned out across Britain westward into what is now Wales, northward into the Midlands and beyond. Resistance was fierce in many places. The southwest peninsula, the territory of the Dumnonii and the Juritrages, was brought to heel by a young legate named Vespasian, who much later would himself become emperor. He stormed hillfort after hillfort, including Maiden Castle itself, whose defenders met the iron discipline of Rome with courage and were overwhelmed. But the most dramatic resistance was yet to come. In the year 60 or 61 after Christ, a woman rose up against Roman rule with a fury that Rome had not anticipated and has never quite forgotten. Her name was Boudica. She was queen of the Iceni, a tribe occupying much of what is now Norfolk and Suffolk. Her husband, King Prasutagus, had ruled as a client king under Roman authority, a common enough arrangement, by which local rulers were permitted to continue governing their own people as long as they acknowledged Roman supremacy. When Prasutagus died, he left his kingdom jointly to his two daughters and to the Roman emperor, hoping the arrangement would protect his family and his people. Rome ignored his wishes entirely. Roman officials annexed the Iceni territory as if it was simply a conquered land. They confiscated the property of Iceni nobles. They flogged Boudica herself and assaulted her daughters. It was a catastrophic miscalculation, an act of casual brutality that transformed a cooperative client queen into the leader of one of the most dangerous revolts the Roman Empire would ever face in Britain. The Iceni rose. Neighboring tribes joined them, and Boudica led her forces southward with devastating effect. Camulodunum Colchester fell first. The Roman colony that had been established with typical arrogance, its temple to the deified Claudius a symbol of conquest and humiliation to the British people forced to fund it. Boudica's army destroyed it utterly, massacring the inhabitants and burning the city to the ground. A thin layer of red ash, deposited in those terrible days, can still be found by archaeologists beneath the streets of modern Colchester. Then London, already growing into a significant trading center even in these early decades of Roman rule, was sacked and burned. Then Verulamium, the Roman town at what is now St. Albans, suffered the same fate. Tens of thousands of people were killed. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, had been away on the far side of Britain, campaigning in Wales, attacking the Druid stronghold on the island of Anglesey, when the revolt erupted, and he returned to find 3 of his major cities in ashes. He regrouped. He chose his ground carefully, and then, with a force considerably smaller than that which Boudica commanded, he fought the battle that would decide the fate of Roman Britain. The details of where exactly this battle was fought are lost. It was somewhere in the Midlands, most likely along a Roman road, in a place where Suetonius could anchor his flanks on forest and funnel Boudica's numerically superior forces into a killing ground he could control. What is certain is the outcome. Roman discipline and tactical intelligence overcame British numbers and fury. The battle became a rout. Boudica died by her own hand, according to some sources, by illness according to others, and the revolt collapsed. Roman Britain would endure for another 3.5 centuries. But Rome never fully conquered the whole island. The far north, the land beyond the rivers Forth and Clyde, the land that would one day be called Scotland, proved simply too difficult, too rugged, too expensive to hold. The Emperor Hadrian, visiting Britain in AD 122, made the decision that would define the northern limit of Roman power in Britain for generations. He ordered the construction of a wall. Hadrian's wall stretched 73 miles from the Solway Firth in the west to the mouth of the River Tyne in the east, a continuous barrier of stone and turf, punctuated by forts and mile castles and watchtowers, garrisoned by thousands of soldiers drawn from across the empire. Men from Syria and North Africa and the Rhineland stood watch on the wall's northern ramparts, looking out over the windswept moorland of northern Britain, far from everything they had ever known. The wall was not simply a military barrier. It was a statement. It said, "Here is the edge of the civilized world. Here is where Rome ends. Beyond this line, that vast, untamed north, lies something else entirely." It still stands, much of it, running across the Northumberland hills and the Cumbrian moors. You can walk it today. You can place your hand on stones that Roman soldiers also touched, nearly 2,000 years ago, and feel something of the weight of all that time. Inside the wall, Roman Britain settled into something approaching ordinary life. Towns grew, proper Roman towns with forums and basilicas, bathhouses and temples, amphitheaters and aqueducts. Londinium became the capital, a bustling city of perhaps 30,000 people at its height, crisscrossed with streets laid out in the Roman grid. Roads stretched across the country in straight, purposeful lines, cutting through forest and marsh and hill with the confident geometry of an empire that believed it would last forever. Latin was spoken in the towns and among the educated elite. Roman gods were worshipped alongside British ones often, in the relaxed and inclusive way of Roman religion, simply merged together, so that the British goddess Sulis at Bath became Sulis Minerva, honored by Roman soldiers and British pilgrims alike in a great temple complex above the hot springs that still flow beneath the city today. And yet, beneath the Roman surface, much of Britain remained deeply, quietly itself. In the countryside, in the villages, in the upland farms far from the nearest Roman road, people continued to speak their Celtic languages, to honor their old gods, to live their lives in ways not so very different from how their grandparents and great-grandparents had lived before the eagles came. Rome changed Britain, but Britain changed Rome too, in its quiet way. This is how empires work. They arrive with overwhelming force and absolute confidence, convinced of their own superiority, their own permanence, and for a while, sometimes a very long while, they seem unassailable. The roads stretch on, the towns grow, the wall holds, but nothing holds forever. Rome itself was beginning, slowly, to show its age. Across the enormous span of the empire, pressures were building that would eventually prove impossible to contain. And in Britain, as elsewhere, the question was not whether Rome would one day depart, but when and what would remain when it did. That departure, and the extraordinary, turbulent world that it would leave behind, is the story that awaits us next. An age of wandering peoples and petty kingdoms, of saints and warriors, of languages taking root in new soil and old ways struggling to survive. The age of the Anglo-Saxons is coming. But for now, let the legions march on their straight roads through the British dark. Let the fires burn in the bathhouses of Londinium. Let the wind carry the sound of Latin prayers across the hills of a country that was Roman and British, and somehow, quietly, becoming something new. Rome did not leave all at once. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the end of Roman Britain. It was not a single moment, not a day when the last soldier boarded the last ship and the lights went out. It was a long, slow fading, like a fire that burns lower and lower over many hours until, at some point in the darkness, you realize it has gone out entirely and you cannot say exactly when. The pressures on the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries were enormous. From the east and the north, waves of migrating peoples, the Huns, the Goths, the Vandals, were pushing against Rome's frontiers with increasing force, and the empire, vast and expensive and increasingly difficult to govern, was struggling to hold itself together. Britain, on the far western edge of everything, was not a priority. Troops were withdrawn. Governors came and went or didn't come at all. The money to pay soldiers and maintain roads and keep the administrative machinery running began to dry up. In 410, the Emperor Honorius, so the traditional story goes, sent a letter to the cities of Britain telling them to look to their own defense. Whether this is entirely accurate, historians still debate, but it captures something true. Rome was no longer able to protect its most distant province, and Britain was, in some essential sense, on its own. What followed was a period that later generations would call, with a mixture of drama and condescension, the Dark Ages. Dark, supposedly, because so little written evidence survives, because the ordered, literate world of Rome gave way to something more fragmented and harder to see clearly across the distance of time. But it was not dark to the people who lived through it. It was simply life uncertain, yes, often violent, reshaped in ways that must have felt bewildering, but still life, still full of the ordinary business of farming and family and faith and the effort to make sense of a changing world. The towns of Roman Britain did not vanish overnight. Some continued to be inhabited, though in a diminished and altered form. The roads remained, cutting across the landscape, still useful even as the empire that built them dissolved. The language of Christianity, which had taken root in Britain during the later Roman period, persisted and grew, tended by monks and priests in communities that kept learning and literacy alive through the turbulence. But the political landscape was fragmenting rapidly. Where Roman governors had once administered a unified province, now local warlords and petty kings carved out territories for themselves, claiming authority over patches of countryside and defending them with what force they could muster. It was a world of flux, of competing powers, of old identities trying to hold their shape against the pressure of everything that was changing around them. And into this uncertain world, new peoples were coming. From across the North Sea, from the coastlands of what is now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands came the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. They came first as raiders, then as settlers, crossing the grey water in their low, open boats, drawn by the same things that had always drawn people to Britain, land, and the possibility of a better life. The traditional story, preserved in later chronicles, tells of a British king named Vortigern who invited Saxon warriors to Britain as mercenaries fighters for hire, brought in to help defend the crumbling province against raids from the north and west, and who found, too late, that the mercenaries he had summoned had ideas of their own about staying. It is a story that may contain genuine historical memory, though it has been so much embroidered over the centuries that it is difficult to know quite where history ends and legend begins. What is certain is that, over the course of the 5th and 6th centuries, Germanic settlers spread across much of what is now England. They came in family groups and war bands, in fits and starts rather than in any single organized wave. They settled the east and south first, the parts of Britain closest to their homelands across the water, and gradually, generation by generation, pushed further west and north. The Britons, the Celtic-speaking peoples who had been there before, did not simply vanish. They resisted, fought back, retreated into the highlands of the west. Wales and Cornwall and parts of what is now Cumbria remained British, Celtic in language and culture, holding on to an identity that would persist long after the lowlands had changed beyond recognition. And in those western lands, the memory of what had been lost, the old Britain, Roman Britain, the Britain before the strangers came, curdled slowly into legend. It was in this period, somewhere in the shadows between history and myth, that the stories of Arthur were born. Whether a historical Arthur existed as a British warlord or military commander who led resistance against the Anglo-Saxon advance in the late 5th or early 6th century is one of the most enduringly debated questions in all of British history. The earliest sources that mention him are frustratingly vague. There are no contemporary accounts. No Roman-style records give us his birth or death, his battles in careful chronological order, the names of his enemies and allies rendered in the dry, reliable language of administration. What there is instead is echo and shadow, a name that appears in Welsh poetry and early chronicles, associated with great battles and a heroic last stand against the forces of change. The Arthur of legend, the Round Table, the Sword in the Stone, Camelot gleaming on its hill, is a creation of medieval imagination, built up over centuries from a fragment of something that may or may not have been real. But perhaps that is fitting. Arthur is less a historical figure than a feeling, the feeling of a people holding on to something precious as it slips away, the dream of a world that was better once and might be better again. That feeling is very human, and it echoes down through British history in ways that have never entirely gone silent. As the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms consolidated across what would become England, a new order began to take shape. 7 major kingdoms emerged, a grouping that later historians would call the Heptarchy, though in truth the boundaries shifted constantly, kingdoms rising and falling, swallowing their neighbors and being swallowed in turn. Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia to the east, Essex, Sussex, and Wessex in the south, Kent in the southeast. The Anglo-Saxons were pagans when they arrived, worshippers of gods whose names survive, faintly, in our days of the week. Tuesday for Ty, the god of war. Wednesday for Woden, the chief of the gods. Thursday for Tuna, Thor the god of thunder. Friday for Frigg, the goddess of love and fertility. These gods were not so very different, in their essential character, from the Norse gods that would become so familiar through later legend, and the world they inhabited was one of fate and honor and the knowledge that the darkness always lay close. But in the year 597, something arrived on the shores of Kent that would transform Anglo-Saxon England as profoundly as anything since the Germanic migrations themselves. A monk named Augustine landed on the Isle of Thanet with a small group of companions, sent by Pope Gregory in Rome with a mission to convert the pagan English to Christianity. The story of how Christianity came to Anglo-Saxon England is, in truth, more complicated than the traditional account suggests. Christianity had never entirely disappeared from Britain. It had survived in the West, in the Celtic church that flourished in Ireland and Wales and the far north of what is now Scotland, tended in monasteries of extraordinary intellectual vitality. From Ireland, the monk Columba had already established a monastery on the tiny island of Iona, off the west coast of Scotland, in 563, a community that would become one of the great centers of Christian learning and art in the early medieval world. So when Augustine arrived in Kent, Christianity was already present in Britain, just not among the Anglo-Saxons themselves. What followed was a gradual, sometimes complicated process of conversion, kings persuaded by missionaries, warriors accepting the new faith alongside or instead of the old, monasteries founded, churches built, the Latin alphabet and the culture of literacy that came with it spreading slowly through a world that had, in the post-Roman centuries, largely lost the habit of writing things down. The conversion mattered enormously, and not only for spiritual reasons. With Christianity came Latin. With Latin came books, and the copying of manuscripts, and the preservation of knowledge. The monasteries of Anglo-Saxon England became, in time, extraordinary repositories of learning, places where history was recorded, where art was made, where the intellectual life of a wider European culture was kept alive and added to. It was in a Northumbrian monastery, in the early 8th century, that a monk named Bede composed a work that would earn him the title of the father of English history. His ecclesiastical history of the English people, completed around 731, is the single most important source we have for the history of Anglo-Saxon England. It is a remarkable achievement, careful, methodical, drawing on a wide range of sources, animated by a genuine desire to understand the past and record it faithfully for those who would come after. Bede rarely left his monastery. He had no need to. The world came to him in books, in letters, in the accounts of travelers and pilgrims passing through. And what he made from all of it was a history that still shapes how we understand this period more than 1,300 years later. Outside the monasteries, Anglo-Saxon culture was flowering in its own rich ways. The great poem Beowulf, composed somewhere in this period, its exact date and origin still debated, conjures a heroic world of mead-holes and monsters, of loyalty and fate and the darkness that waits at the edges of the firelight. It is the oldest major work of literature in what we would recognize as English, and reading it even today, even in translation, is to hear something ancient and alive. A voice from a world utterly unlike our own and yet somehow deeply recognizable. By the 8th century, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had developed into sophisticated polities, not the crude, barbaric settlements of later caricature, but complex societies with functioning legal systems, thriving trade networks, accomplished art and architecture, and a literate class capable of recording and transmitting knowledge across generations. The Lindisfarne Gospels, produced on a tiny island of the Northumbrian coast around 715, are among the most beautiful objects ever made in Britain. The intricate carpet pages, a dazzling fusion of Celtic, Germanic, and Mediterranean artistic traditions, executed with a precision and artistry that takes the breath away even now. This was the world of Anglo-Saxon England at its flowering. Not dark, not barbaric, but rich and varied, and alive with a culture that deserves to be known and remembered. And it was precisely at this moment of flourishing that the next great disruption arrived. From the north and east, across the cold gray waters of the North Sea, came longships. The dragon-prowed ships of the Norsemen, the people the English would call the Vikings, were on the horizon, and the world that had so patiently built itself up from the ruins of Roman Britain was about to be shaken to its roots once more. But that story, the Age of Raids and Fire, and the extraordinary Alfred of Wessex, is the story of our next passage through the dark. For now, let the monks of Lindisfarne bend over their illuminated pages by candlelight. Let the mead-hall fires burn warm against the Northumbrian night. Let the sound of Old English verse drift across the fields and fens of a kingdom that does not yet know what is coming. Britain is still dreaming. It began, as so many things begin, without warning. On the 8th of June, in the year 793, a group of men came ashore on the small island of Lindisfarne, off the northeast coast of England. The island was home to one of the most celebrated monasteries in the Christian world, a place of scholarship and sanctity, of illuminated manuscripts and quiet prayer, founded more than a century before by the Irish monk Aidan, and hallowed by generations of devoted monks who had made it a center of learning that sent its light across the whole of northern Britain. The men who came ashore that June morning were not pilgrims. They killed. They plundered. They took what they could carry: gold and silver, jeweled reliquaries, anything of value that could be lifted and loaded onto their ships, and they burned what they left behind. And then they were gone, back across the cold water, as swiftly and suddenly as they had come. The raid on Lindisfarne sent a shockwave through the Christian world. The scholar Alcuin, writing from the court of the Emperor Charlemagne on the continent, expressed the horror of an entire civilization in a single question: what might such an attack on so holy a place portend? It felt, to those who witnessed it and heard of it, like the end of something, like the world tipping toward darkness. They did not yet know how right they were. The people the English called the Vikings, a word whose origins are still debated, perhaps meaning something like sea raiders or those who lurk in the inlets, came from Scandinavia, from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. They were not, it is important to say, simply destroyers. In their own homelands they were farmers and fishermen, craftsmen and traders, poets and storytellers. Their longships were masterpieces of nautical engineering, shallow draft enough to navigate rivers, steady enough to cross open ocean, fast enough to outrun almost anything that might pursue them. They were accomplished navigators who would eventually reach Iceland, Greenland, and the shores of North America centuries before Columbus. But in Britain, in these early decades, they came primarily to take. The monasteries were obvious targets, wealthy, largely undefended, filled with precious objects accumulated over generations of pious donation. Year after year, the raids intensified. Jarrow, Iona, Portmahon, holy places that had seemed inviolable, were sacked and burned. Monks fled or died. Manuscripts were lost. Communities that had sustained the flame of learning through the post-Roman darkness were extinguished or scattered. And then, in the middle of the 9th century, something changed. The Vikings stopped raiding and started staying. In 865, a large Danish army landed in East Anglia. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of the great historical documents of medieval England, begun later in the century, calls it the Great Heathen Army, and it certainly was, at least by the standards of the time. This was not a raiding party looking for portable wealth. It was a force of conquest, intent on settlement, led by men whose ambition extended not to plunder but to land. Over the following years, the Great Heathen Army moved through England with devastating effect. Northumbria fell. East Anglia fell. Its king, Edmund, was captured and killed, shot through with arrows, when he refused to renounce his faith, according to later tradition, and venerated as a martyr and saint thereafter. Mercia was overwhelmed. One by one, the kingdoms of the Heptarchy crumbled before the Danish advance. By the 870s, only one Anglo-Saxon kingdom remained undefeated, Wessex, and Wessex was ruled by a young king named Alfred. Alfred came to the throne of Wessex in 871, in the middle of a crisis so severe that his kingdom's survival was genuinely in doubt. He was perhaps 22 years old. He had grown up in a royal family acutely conscious of the Danish threat, had traveled to Rome as a child and imbibed something of the wider Christian civilization he would later spend his life defending. He was, by every account we have, a man of unusual qualities, not just a capable military commander, but a genuine intellectual, a lover of books and learning, a man who thought deeply about what it meant to rule and what a kingdom was for. In the winter of 878, things reached their worst point. A surprise Danish attack in January during the Christmas season, when no one expected to fight, drove Alfred from his kingdom entirely. He fled into the Somerset marshes with a small band of followers, reduced to hiding in the swamps and fens of Athelney, a fugitive in his own land. It was here, according to one of the most famous stories in all of English legend, that Alfred took shelter in a peasant woman's cottage and was asked to watch over some cakes baking by the fire. Lost in thought about his kingdom and his troubles, he let the cakes burn. The woman, not knowing who he was, scolded him roundly. It is a small story, perhaps apocryphal, and yet it has survived for 11 centuries because it captures something endearing about Alfred, this king reduced to hiding in a marsh, worrying not about bread but about his people. Alfred did not hide for long. In the spring of 878, he summoned the FYD, the Anglo-Saxon militia, and the men of Somerset and Wiltshire and Hampshire answered. At the Battle of Edington, Alfred met the Danish army under its king Guthrum and defeated it decisively. What followed was not simply a military victory but something more considered and more lasting. Rather than pursuing the Danes to annihilation, Alfred negotiated. Guthrum agreed to be baptized as a Christian, with Alfred himself standing as his godfather. A boundary was drawn across England. East of it would be the Danelaw, where Danish law and custom would prevail. West of it would be Alfred's England. It was a settlement born of pragmatism rather than idealism. Alfred knew he could not expel the Danes from England entirely, and he did not try. What he could do was stabilize the situation, create a defensible line, and begin the work of rebuilding everything that had been damaged and lost. And that rebuilding was perhaps Alfred's greatest achievement. He constructed a network of fortified towns called bays across Wessex and the territories he controlled, spaced close enough together that no point in his kingdom was more than a day's march from a place of refuge. Each burh was maintained and garrisoned by the local community, its defenses kept in permanent readiness. It was a system of national defense unlike anything England had seen before, and it worked when the Danes raided again in later years. They found Wessex a far harder place to plunder than it had once been. Alfred reformed the army so that the FYD operated in rotation, half on duty at any time and half at home, ensuring that farm work could continue while defense was maintained. He rebuilt the fleet, commissioning longer, more stable ships designed to intercept Danish vessels before they could land. He was, in the truest sense, the architect of English national defense, but it was his program of intellectual and cultural renewal that sets Alfred apart from almost every other ruler of his age. He grieved the learning that had been lost. He lamented, in his own words, that when he came to the throne there were very few men south of the Humber who could understand their service books in English or translate a letter from Latin. The monasteries, those repositories of literacy and knowledge, had been ravaged. The educated class that had sustained Anglo-Saxon intellectual life had been scattered or killed. Alfred set about repairing this, with a personal commitment and energy that is remarkable. He gathered scholars from across England and beyond, from Wales, from the continent, from wherever learning still flourished, and brought them to his court. He himself learned Latin as an adult, laboring over the texts with characteristic determination, and then translated key works from Latin into Old English himself, so that his people could read them in their own tongue. The Pastoral Care of Pope Gregory, The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, The Ecclesiastical History of Bede, He sent copies of the pastoral care to every bishop in his kingdom, with a preface written in his own hand, in his own voice explaining what he was doing and why. It is the earliest surviving document of English prose. The voice in it is unmistakably Alfred's, thoughtful, earnest, a little melancholy, and completely alive. Alfred died in 899. He was perhaps 50 years old. He left behind a kingdom transformed, more organized, better defended, more literate, more self-consciously English than the fragmented world he had inherited. He had not reconquered all of England from the Danes. That work would be left to his children and grandchildren. But he had saved something essential, held a thread that might otherwise have snapped entirely, and woven it into the beginning of something new. His son Edward continued the work. His grandson Athelstan, in 927, brought all of England under a single crown for the first time in history, a moment that, with some justification, can be called the founding of England as a unified nation. The Vikings, meanwhile, did not dissipate. They settled, assimilated, married into English families, learned English ways even as English ways absorbed something of theirs. The Danelaw left its mark on the landscape in thousands of place names, the suffix by, meaning village, in Derby, Whitby, Grimsby, the suffix thorpe, meaning hamlet, in Scunthorpe and Cleethorpes, Thwaite, meaning clearing, in countless northern villages. Wherever you see these endings on a map of England, you are looking at the fossil of a Viking settlement, the linguistic shadow of people who crossed the sea 1,000 years ago and never entirely went home. And yet, just as England seemed to be settling into a new stability, just as the Danish threat seemed to be absorbed, the kingdom unified. The worst of the storms weathered, the Vikings came again. In the late 10th century, a new wave of Danish raids began, larger and more systematic than before, backed now by the power of the Danish kingdom under ambitious and capable kings. The English king Ethelred, remembered unkindly by history as Ethelred the Unready, though the nickname is a mistranslation of the Old English meaning something more like ill-counseled, responded with a mixture of military effort, payment of tribute, and catastrophic political miscalculation. The tribute payments to Danegeld, the money paid to make the Danes go away, bought peace temporarily but never permanently, and the sums required grew larger year by year. In 1013, the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard invaded England in force and drove Ethelred into exile. Sweyn died the following year, and Ethelred returned, but the crisis was not over. Sweyn's son Canute, as he is sometimes known, returned with another army, and after a prolonged struggle, became King of England in 1016. Nut was, by any measure, a remarkable ruler. He governed England wisely, respected its laws and customs, promoted Englishmen as well as Danes to positions of power, and was by any measure a legitimate and effective king. He also ruled Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden, making England, for a brief and rather extraordinary period, the center of a North Sea empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Baltic. It did not last. After Nut's death in 1035, his empire fragmented and England reverted to the Old English royal line. But the Viking Age had left its mark in the landscape, in the language, in the blood of the people. England was a country made of layers, and the Norse layer ran deep. The next great disruption was already gathering on the horizon, though no one in England yet knew it. Across the Channel, in the Duchy of Normandy itself settled, a century and a half before, by Norse Vikings, a duke was watching events in England with close attention and growing ambition. His name was William, and the world he was about to make would be unlike anything England had ever known. But that is the story that waits for us next. For now, let the longships rest on the beach. Let the mead holes of the Danelaw grow quiet. Let the monks return, slowly, to their copied pages and their careful prayers. The sea is calm tonight. In the year 1066, 3 men believed they had the right to be king of England. Only one of them would live to claim it. The first was Harold Godwinson, the most powerful nobleman in England, Earl of Wessex, brother-in-law to the recently deceased King Edward, whom history would call the Confessor. Harold was English by birth and culture, a man the English nobility knew and trusted, and when Edward died in January of 1066 without a clear heir, the Great Council of England, the Witan, chose Harold as king. He was crowned on the very day of Edward's funeral, in the newly consecrated Westminster Abbey, with a speed that suggests everyone knew what was coming and wanted a king in place before it arrived. The second claimant was Harald Hardrada, Harold the Hard Ruler, King of Norway, a warrior of towering reputation who believed, through a complex chain of dynastic argument, that the throne of England was rightfully his. He was a man whose name had been spoken with something approaching or across the whole of northern Europe for 30 years, a veteran of campaigns from Constantinople to the Black Sea, perhaps the most feared military commander of his age. The third was William, Duke of Normandy. He claimed that Edward the Confessor had promised him the throne years before, and that Harold himself, during a visit to Normandy that may or may not have been voluntary, had sworn a sacred oath to support William's claim. Whether the oath had been freely given, whether it had any legal weight, whether the promise was ever truly made, all of this was disputed then and is disputed still. But William believed, or chose to believe, that England was his by right, and he was not a man who let go of things he believed were his. The crisis came from the north first. In September 1066, Harald Hardrada landed in Yorkshire with a large Norwegian army, allied with Harold Godwinson's own estranged brother Tostig. They advanced inland, defeated a local English force at the Battle of Fulford Gate, and accepted the surrender of York. Harold Godwinson was in the south, watching the channel for William's fleet, when the news reached him. What followed was one of the most remarkable military marches in English history. Harold gathered his army and moved north at extraordinary speed, covering roughly 300 miles in less than a week, arriving in Yorkshire before the Norwegians had any idea he was coming. On the 25th of September, at a place called Stamford Bridge near York, Harold caught the Norwegian army completely by surprise. The battle was decisive and brutal. Harald Hardrada was killed. Tostig was killed. The Norwegian army, which had arrived in 300 ships, limped home in fewer than 30. The threat from the north was over. Harold had no time to celebrate. 2 days later, on the 27th of September, the wind in the English Channel changed direction. William of Normandy, who had been waiting for weeks with his army assembled and his fleet ready, seized his moment. He crossed the Channel and landed on the Sussex coast near Pevensey. Harold turned his exhausted army around and marched south. The decision to engage William immediately, rather than resting his troops and gathering more forces, has been debated by historians ever since. Harold may have feared that William would ravage the Sussex countryside, which was Harold's own home territory, unless checked quickly. He may have been confident in his army's fighting quality. He may simply have been a decisive man who preferred action to waiting. On the 14th of October, 1066, the two armies met on a ridge near the town of Hastings. The battle lasted all day, an unusually long engagement for the period, a testament to the quality of both forces and the stubbornness with which the English FYID held their position on the ridge. Harold's men formed a wall of shields along the high ground and held it for hour after hour against repeated Norman cavalry charges and volleys of arrows. The Norman attack was fierce and disciplined, but the English line held. And then, late in the afternoon, something shifted. The exact sequence of events is disputed. The Bayeux Tapestry, that extraordinary embroidered narrative, created within a generation of the battle, our most vivid visual record of the day, shows an arrow striking a figure who may or may not be Harold in the eye. Whether Harold died from an arrow or was cut down by Norman knights in the final collapse of the English line, he was killed. And with their king dead, the English resistance broke. The Battle of Hastings was over. England had a new king. William moved carefully but inexorably. He ravaged the countryside around Hastings, burning villages and destroying crops, a deliberate demonstration of what resistance would cost. He marched on London, the remaining English nobles and churchmen, their army destroyed and their king dead, submitted. On Christmas Day 1066, in Westminster Abbey, the same church where Harold had been crowned less than a year before William was consecrated King of England, the ceremony did not go entirely smoothly. When the congregation inside the abbey shouted their acclamation of the new king, the Norman soldiers standing guard outside, not understanding what the noise meant, assumed a riot had broken out and began setting fire to the surrounding buildings. The ceremony continued inside while London burned a little outside. It was, perhaps, an omen of what was to come. The Norman conquest was the most transformative event in English history since the Anglo-Saxon migration 6 centuries before, and its effects ran deeper and lasted longer than almost anything else in the story of these islands. William rewarded his followers with the land of England. The Anglo-Saxon nobility, the thegns and earls who had run the country for generations, were dispossessed wholesale, their estates redistributed to Norman barons who owed their wealth and power entirely to the king. Within a generation, the entire landowning class of England had been replaced. The new aristocracy spoke French. Their castles, the great square stone keeps that still dominate so many English towns and cities, from the Tower of London to Rochester to Colchester, rose above the English landscape as physical symbols of a new order, visible for miles around, impossible to ignore. The language shifted. French became the language of the court, of the law, of power and prestige. English, the Old English of Alfred and Bede and Beowulf, was relegated to the language of the common people, the unfashionable tongue of the defeated. And yet it survived, as languages spoken by millions always survive, and in the centuries that followed it absorbed thousands of French and Latin words and emerged as something new and richer, the Middle English that Geoffrey Chaucer would one day write in, the ancestor of the language in which these words are spoken now. Look at English today and you can see the conquest written into its vocabulary. The animals in the field are English: cow, sheep, pig, day. The meat on the table is French: beef, mutton, pork, venison. The farmers who raised the animals spoke English. The Norman lords who ate them spoke French. The language remembers. The Domesday Book, commissioned by William in 1085 and completed in 1086, is one of the most extraordinary documents ever produced in Britain. A comprehensive survey of almost the entire country, recording who owned what land, how much it was worth, how many people lived on it, what resources it contained. Nothing like it had been attempted anywhere in Europe. It was a bureaucratic achievement of staggering ambition, and it tells us more about life in late 11th century England than almost any other source. It also tells us something about William himself. He wanted to know everything about his kingdom, its value, its capacity, its resources. He was not simply a conqueror but an administrator of formidable ability, a man who understood that power needed to be organized and recorded and sustained. The Domesday Book is, among other things, a monument to the Norman genius for governance. William died in 1087, from injuries sustained during a campaign in France thrown against his saddle pommel when his horse stumbled, his injuries worsening over weeks until he died in considerable pain. He left England to his son William Rufus, and Normandy to his eldest son Robert. The division would cause problems for generations, but the world William had made could not be unmade. The century after the conquest was one of turbulence and transformation. William Rufus was killed in a hunting accident in the New Forest in 1100, quite possibly murdered, though no one was ever accused. His younger brother Henry seized the throne with impressive speed, and Henry I proved a capable and ruthless ruler who spent much of his reign keeping the combined inheritance of England and Normandy from falling apart. When he died in 1135, leaving no legitimate male heir, his only son having drowned in the wreck of the White Ship 15 years before, In one of the great tragedies of medieval England, the country descended into a period of civil war between his daughter Matilda and his nephew Stephen that would last for nearly 20 years. The chroniclers called it the Anarchy. They wrote that Christ and his saints slept. Castles multiplied across the countryside. Local lords extorted and terrorized the people under their control. The careful administrative machinery that the Normans had built ground and stuttered. It ended, eventually, in compromise. Stephen kept the throne for his lifetime, but agreed that Matilda's son, a young man named Henry of Anjou, vigorous and brilliantly intelligent, already Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou in his own right, would succeed him. Stephen died in 1154. Henry II became king, and with him began one of the most consequential reigns in English history, a reign that would give England the beginnings of its common law, that would embroil a king in the murder of an archbishop, and that would plant the seeds of a constitutional crisis whose resolution would echo down through 8 centuries to the present day. But that extraordinary story of Thomas Becket and Magna Carta and the slow, painful birth of English law, that is the story that awaits us next. For now, let the Domesday scribes set down their quills. Let the Norman castles stand dark against the winter sky. Let the English people go about their lives in 2 languages, neither quite vanquished, neither quite victorious. England is still becoming itself. Henry II came to the throne of England in 1154 like a force of nature. He was 21 years old, red-haired, stocky, restlessly energetic, a man who rarely sat still, who conducted business while walking, who wore out horses and courtiers alike with the sheer relentless pace of his activity. He ruled not just England but a vast sweep of territory stretching from the Scottish border in the north to the Pyrenees in the south, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and through his marriage to the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, the great Duchy of Aquitaine as well. Historians call this accumulation of lands the Angevin Empire, though Henry himself would have bristled at the implication that any of it was less than legitimately his. He inherited a country bruised and disordered by nearly 2 decades of civil war, and he set about repairing it with characteristic ferocity. Unlicensed castles were demolished. Royal authority was reasserted over barons who had grown accustomed to acting as independent powers. And most importantly, most lastingly, Henry began the transformation of English law into something that had never existed anywhere quite like it before. Before Henry, justice in England was a patchwork of local customs, baronial courts, church courts, and royal intervention when the king chose to involve himself. Henry systematized it. He sent royal judges traveling on circuits across the country, bringing the king's justice to every corner of the realm rather than requiring every dispute to find its way to the royal court. He expanded the use of juries, groups of local men who knew the community and could testify to local facts as a way of determining cases. He created new legal processes, new writs, new procedures that brought more and more of English life under the authority of a single, consistent, royal law. It was the foundation of the English common law, the legal tradition that, centuries later, would travel with English settlers to America, to Australia, to Canada, to India, to every corner of the world touched by the British Empire, and that still shapes the legal systems of dozens of countries today. The jury, the adversarial trial, the principle that no man should be imprisoned without due process, these things have Henry II somewhere in their ancestry, buried deep but real. He did not, of course, intend it as a gift to posterity. He intended it as a consolidation of royal power. But history rarely cares about intentions. Henry's great catastrophe was a friendship. Thomas Becket was the son of a London merchant, brilliant and ambitious, who had risen through the church and the royal administration to become Henry's chancellor, his chief minister, his closest companion, his friend. The 2 men were inseparable for years, hunting together, laughing together, sharing the work of government in a partnership of unusual warmth and mutual trust. When the Archbishop of Canterbury died in 1162, Henry appointed Becket to the position, expecting his friend to bring the Church of England family under royal control as he had brought everything else. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Becket, upon taking the archbishopric, underwent what appeared to be a genuine transformation, abandoning the luxurious habits of his years as chancellor, wearing a hair shirt beneath his robes, throwing himself into the defense of church rights against royal encroachment with a tenacity that left Henry baffled and then furious. The quarrel between them deepened over years, driven by genuine disagreements about the relationship between royal and church authority, who had the right to try clergy accused of crimes, how far papal authority extended over the English church, where the king's power ended and God's began. Becket went into exile in France. Negotiations continued, failed, resumed. Eventually, in 1170, a fragile reconciliation brought Becket back to England. It lasted weeks. On the 29th of December 1170, four knights who had heard Henry in a rage during a Christmas feast in Normandy cry out words to the effect of "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" rode to Canterbury Cathedral and murdered Thomas Becket at the altar. The shock was immense. An archbishop, killed in his own cathedral, at the holiest time of the year. Miracles were reported at Becket's tomb almost immediately. The sick healed, the dying saved. Within 3 years he was canonized as a saint. His shrine at Canterbury became one of the greatest pilgrimage destinations in all of Christendom, drawing the faithful from across Europe for the next 3.5 centuries. The road from London to Canterbury, traveled by generations of pilgrims, would one day give Chaucer the setting for his Canterbury Tales, that great, boisterous, compassionate portrait of medieval England in all its variety and humanity. Henry did penance. He walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury and submitted to being flogged by the monks at Becket's tomb, an extraordinary public humiliation for the most powerful ruler in Western Europe, a demonstration of just how thoroughly the Mater had damaged him. But he survived. His reign continued for another 19 years, though the last years were bitter, spent fighting rebellions led by his own sons, egged on by the still formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had become his implacable enemy. He died in 1189, having learned, too late, that his youngest and most beloved son John had joined the rebellion against him. His last words were, reportedly, "Shame, shame on a conquered king." His son Richard, who succeeded him, is one of the most romanticized figures in English history, and one of the most absent kings England ever had. Richard I the Lionheart spent less than 6 months of his 10-year reign actually in England. He spoke French, not English. He regarded his kingdom primarily as a source of revenue to fund his military adventures. The vast majority of his reign was spent on crusade in the Holy Land, in captivity in Austria, or fighting to recover his French territories. England, in his absence, ran itself governed by capable ministers, taxed heavily, essentially left to its own devices. And yet the legend of Richard shines on, undimmed, across 8 centuries. There is something about the idea of the Crusader king, the warrior in the service of a great cause, that caught and kept the popular imagination in ways that made good governance never could. His brother John, who succeeded him in 1199, had no such luck with posterity. John was not, in truth, the uncomplicated villain that legend makes him. He was a capable administrator, often present in his kingdom in ways Richard never was, attentive to the details of government and law. But he was also suspicious to the point of paranoia, capable of real cruelty, politically maladroit in ways that managed to alienate almost everyone whose support he needed. He lost Normandy to the French king in 1204, a catastrophe that severed the English nobility from their continental estates and, paradoxically, forced them to think of themselves as English rather than Norman for the first time. He quarreled with the Pope so severely that England was placed under an interdict with all church services suspended for years. He taxed his barons so heavily and so arbitrarily that they eventually ran out of patience entirely. In 1215, the barons of England rose in rebellion. They forced John to meet them at a meadow beside the Thames called Runnymede, and there they presented him with a document he had no choice but to seal. Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Magna Carta was not, in origin, a document about the rights of ordinary people. It was a list of baronial grievances, a set of specific demands from a specific group of powerful men who wanted specific abuses of royal power to stop. Most of its clauses deal with feudal dues, inheritance rights, the proper conduct of royal courts, and the practical complaints of a landed aristocracy pushed too far by an arbitrary king. But buried within it were principles of wider significance. No free man shall be seized, imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, or exiled except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. To no one will we sell, to no one will we deny or delay right or justice. These clauses gestured toward something larger than baronial self-interest, toward the idea that even the king was subject to law, that power had limits, that certain protections existed that no ruler could simply sweep away. John had no intention of honoring it. He appealed to the Pope, who annulled the charter as illegal. Civil war resumed. John died the following year from dysentery, in the middle of a campaign, and Magna Carta, reissued and revised by the Regency government of his young son Henry III, began its long transformation from a feudal settlement document into a founding text of constitutional liberty. It would be cited by parliamentarians against Charles I in the 17th century. It would be echoed in the American Declaration of Independence and Constitution in the 18th. It would be invoked in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the 20th. The meadow at Runnymede, on a June day in 1215, cast a shadow that reached far beyond anything anyone standing there could possibly have imagined. The 13th and 14th centuries brought England further into the medieval world in all its complexity, soaring cathedrals reaching toward heaven, universities at Oxford and Cambridge establishing themselves as centers of European learning, a wool trade that made England one of the wealthiest countries in Europe, the beginnings of Parliament as an institution with a real role in government. And then, in 1348, something arrived on English shores that swept all of it: the wealth, the learning, the carefully constructed structures of society into a terrible perspective. The Black Death, the bubonic, pneumonic, devastatingly infectious plague had been moving westward across Asia and Europe for years before it reached England. It arrived in the summer of 1348, probably through the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset, and it moved through the population with a speed and lethality that left contemporaries struggling to find any framework adequate to describe what they were experiencing. There was no understanding of how it spread, no treatment that worked, no defense against it. It killed, by the best modern estimates, somewhere between a third and a half of England's entire population in the space of 2 years. Perhaps 2 million people, out of a population of perhaps 5 million. Villages were emptied. Priests died administering lost rites, and there were not enough living priests to replace them. Harvests rotted in fields because there were not enough people left to bring them in. The world that survived was fundamentally different from the world that had entered the plague years. Labor was suddenly scarce, and scarce labor could demand better wages and conditions. The rigid social hierarchy of the feudal system, in which peasants were bound to the land and to their lord with few rights and little recourse, began slowly but irreversibly to loosen. The catastrophe of the Black Death planted seeds of social change that would take generations to fully flower, but flower they did. In the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, in the slow dissolution of serfdom, in the gradual, grinding expansion of what it meant to have rights in England. The medieval centuries closed in shadows the long, ruinous conflict with France that history calls the 100 Years' War, draining English resources and energy for generations. The brilliant victories of Crécy and Agincourt balanced against years of grinding loss and ultimate failure. The final expulsion of English forces from France in 1453, leaving nothing of the old continental empire but the port of Calais. And then, with almost indecent timing, England turned its exhausted soldiers on itself. The Wars of the Roses, the dynastic struggle between the houses of York and Lancaster, both descended from Edward III, both with plausible claims to the throne, consumed the last decades of the 15th century in a series of battles, betrayals, and sudden reversals of fortune that left the English nobility thinned and exhausted and the country ready, at last, for something new. That something new arrived in 1485, on a battlefield in Leicestershire called Bosworth, where a Welsh-born claimant named Henry Tudor defeated and killed the last Plantagenet king, Richard III, and placed a crown on his own head. A new dynasty had begun. A new age was opening. The world of stone castles and wandering pilgrims and plague carts creaking through empty villages was giving way to something harder to name, more expansive, more questioning, more restless. The Renaissance was stirring in Italy and moving northward. The printing press was changing what it meant to know things. Sailors were venturing further across the Atlantic than anyone had dared before. England was about to step onto a larger stage. But that is a story for the next part of our journey, as the fires of the Reformation begin to kindle and the Tudor century opens like a door onto a world we would, for the first time, begin to recognize as almost our own. For now, let the candles burn low in the great cathedrals. Let the plague bells fall silent. Let the roses red and white both rest on the cold ground of Bosworth Field. The medieval world is ending. The Tudor century began quietly. Henry VII, the man who had won his crown in the mud and chaos of Bosworth, was not a dramatic figure in the manner of the kings who would follow him. He was cautious, watchful, financially meticulous, deeply aware that his claim to the throne rested on a battle victory rather than an unassailable bloodline, and determined to build something that could not easily be knocked down. He stabilized the finances of the crown. He ended the dynastic bloodletting of the Wars of the Roses by marrying Elizabeth of York, uniting the two competing royal lines in a single household. He cultivated trade, encouraged merchants, and began the slow process of turning England outward toward the wider world. When he died in 1509, he left a kingdom that was solvent, stable, and at peace. It was, by the standards of what had come before, a remarkable achievement, the achievement of a man whose name is rarely spoken with the excitement reserved for his successors, but whose quiet competence made everything that followed possible. His son was anything but quiet. Henry VIII is one of the most recognizable figures in all of English history, the vast, magnificent, terrifying presence familiar from Holbein's portrait, legs planted wide, gaze direct and challenging. A man who seems, even on a flat canvas, to fill every room he enters. He came to the throne at 17, handsome and athletic, a gifted musician and scholar as well as a formidable jouster, hailed by the humanist scholars of the age as a new golden king for a new golden era. Thomas More called him a man for all seasons. Erasmus, the greatest intellectual in Europe, praised him in the most extravagant terms. The gold did not last. Henry's reign of 38 years was one of the most consequential in English history, and not only because of the 6 wives whose fates divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Every English schoolchild is taught to remember with a mnemonic. What Henry did to England went far deeper than matrimonial drama. He broke it from Rome. The English Reformation began, at least in its immediate political cause, with a problem of succession. Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had given him a daughter, the future Mary I, but no surviving son, and Henry was convinced that without a male heir, the Tudor dynasty would not survive. He wanted the marriage annulled. The Pope, under considerable pressure from Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, refused. Henry's response was to remove the Pope's authority over the English Church entirely. It was done incrementally, through Parliament. Over several years in the early 1530s, a series of acts that transferred ecclesiastical authority from Rome to the crown, culminating in the Act of Supremacy of 1534, which declared Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. It was a revolution accomplished through legislation, and it changed England forever. Thomas More, the same man who had praised Henry so lavishly at his accession, refused to accept the royal supremacy and was executed for it. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's brilliant and ruthless chief minister, directed the dissolution of the monasteries and the seizure by the crown of the enormous monastic estates that had accumulated over 5 centuries of pious donation. 600 religious houses, their lands, their buildings, their wealth all absorbed into the royal treasury, their communities dispersed, their libraries scattered, their stone quarried for the grand houses of a new Protestant gentry class. It was the greatest redistribution of land in England since the Norman conquest. Henry died in 1547, leaving behind a country that had changed more in 2 decades than in the previous 2 centuries, and a succession crisis that would consume the following years. His son Edward VI, a sickly, earnest Protestant boy of 9, reigned for 6 years under the control of Protestant regents who pushed the Reformation further and faster than Henry had ever intended. Then Edward died, and the country swung violently back. Mary I, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, raised a devout Catholic and convinced that her life's purpose was to retain England to Rome, restored papal authority, burned nearly 300 Protestants at the stake in 5 years, and aimed the name Bloody Mary from a Protestant tradition that has never entirely let go of it, though the violence of her reign was modest by the standards of continental religious conflict. She died in 1558, childless, her religious restoration dying with her. And then Elizabeth came. Elizabeth I ascended the throne at 25 and would hold it for 4 to 5 years, one of the longest reigns in English history, one of the most celebrated, a reign that has accumulated around it such a weight of mythology and nostalgia that it is almost impossible now to see the reality clearly through the golden haze. The reality was formidable enough. Elizabeth was her father's daughter in her political instincts, shrewd, cautious, watchful, reluctant to commit herself until commitment was unavoidable. She settled the religious question for a generation, at least with a characteristically pragmatic compromise, the Elizabethan settlement, which established a Church of England Protestant in doctrine but conservative in ceremony, broad enough to accommodate most of her subjects without requiring anyone to examine their conscience too closely. It satisfied neither committed Catholics nor committed Puritans, but it kept the peace, which was her primary objective. Her court was a place of extraordinary cultural brilliance. The poets and playwrights who flourished in the Elizabethan age produced a body of work that has never been surpassed in the English language. Marlowe and Spenser and Sidney and, above all others, the man from Stratford-upon-Avon whose plays and sonnets would become, over the centuries, the most widely read and performed works in the history of world literature. William Shakespeare wrote in the London of Elizabeth and her successor, and the English he wrote in richer, more flexible, more capacious than anything the language had been before, is recognizably the ancestor of the English spoken today. England was also looking outward with new ambition. Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe between 1577 and 1580. English merchants and adventurers were pushing into the Atlantic, trading along the West African coast, beginning the first tentative settlements in the Americas. The seeds of empire were being planted, though no one yet knew how vast a harvest they would eventually yield. The greatest crisis of Elizabeth's reign came in 1588, when Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch in the world, ruler of Spain, Portugal, the Spanish Netherlands, and a colonial empire stretching across the Americas, sent his armada against England. 130 ships, carrying thousands of soldiers, intended to overthrow Elizabeth, restore Catholicism, and bring England back under the authority of Rome. The armada failed. English ships, smaller and more maneuverable, harried the Spanish fleet up the Channel. Storms did the rest, wrecking ships on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland as the scattered armada tried to make its way home around the top of the British Isles. The victory was celebrated with a fervor that has never quite faded the small island nation that had faced down the greatest empire in the world and prevailed, or been preserved by Providence, depending on which version of the story you preferred. Elizabeth lived until 1603, dying in her 70th year, the last of the Tudors, having never married and never named her successor until the very end. The crown passed to James VI of Scotland, son of the executed Mary Queen of Scots, who became James I of England, uniting the English and Scottish crowns in a single person for the first time, though the two kingdoms remained legally separate for another century. The Stuart century brought darker weather. James I was learned, thoughtful, and comprehensively unsuited to the peculiar demands of English political culture. He believed in the divine right of kings, the doctrine that monarchs received their authority directly from God and were answerable to no earthly power, with a theological conviction that the English Parliament found increasingly insufferable. The constitutional tension between a crown that believed its power was absolute and a parliament that believed it had rights and privileges the crown could not override had been present for generations, managed carefully by Elizabeth through a combination of charm and evasion. James had neither her charm nor her patience for evasion. His son Charles I had still less of both. The story of how England slid from constitutional argument into civil war between 1629 and 1642, the king ruling without parliament for 11 years, attempting to impose religious uniformity on Scotland, provoking a Scottish rebellion that forced him to recall parliament, and then finding that the parliament he had recalled had grievances it intended to address, is one of the most complex and consequential in English history. The civil war that followed, from 1642 to 1651, was fought not just over politics but over fundamental questions about the nature of authority and the limits of power that would not be finally resolved for generations. The new model army, disciplined, well-organized, infused with Puritan religious conviction, proved decisively superior to the royalist forces in the field. Charles was captured. He was tried in an event without precedent in English history. A reigning monarch arraigned before a court convicted of high treason against his own people, and executed on a scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall on the 30th of January 1649. The crowd, by all accounts, let out a great collective groan when the axe fell. Whatever they had thought about the king in life, the sight of a monarch publicly beheaded was something for which nothing in English experience had prepared them. The Republic that followed the Commonwealth, then the Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell, lasted 11 years. Cromwell was a man of genuine greatness and genuine ferocity, a military genius and a religious visionary who was also capable of devastating brutality, most notoriously in his Irish campaigns of 1649 and 1650, where towns were massacred and populations displaced in ways that sank deep into Irish memory and have never been entirely forgotten. When Cromwell died in 1658, the Republic died with him. His son Richard, inheriting the Protectorate, lacked the authority to hold it together. Within 2 years, the army and Parliament had concluded that a return to monarchy was the only stable solution, and Charles II, the executed king's son, who had spent years in exile on the continent, was invited home. He arrived in London on his 30th birthday in May 1660, riding through streets lined with cheering crowds, and the Restoration began. Charles II, witty, cynical, pleasure-loving, far more politically shrewd than his casual manner suggested, restored the monarchy without revenge, settled the most pressing constitutional questions with a pragmatism his father had never managed, and presided over a court of brilliant, dissolute, endlessly fascinating cultural life. Pepys wrote his diary. Wren designed his churches in the rubble of the Great Fire of 1666. Newton sat in his garden and thought about gravity. England was restless, brilliant, and changing faster than it knew. The next great transformation, the one that would lift it from a middling European power to the center of a global empire, was already beginning in the counting houses of the city of London and the tobacco fields of Virginia and the slave forts of the West African coast. But that story, the story of empire and industry and the world that made the modern age, is the story that awaits us next. For now, let the candles burn in the Restoration theatres. Let Newton's apple fall in the quiet of the Lincolnshire garden. Let the sound of London rebuilding itself after the fire drift across the river in the autumn dark. England has survived its revolution, and the world it is about to build will change everything. In the year 1700, Britain was a middling European power. It had a growing navy, a restless merchant class, a few scattered trading posts and colonial settlements scattered along the eastern seaboard of North America and in the Caribbean. It was prosperous enough, influential enough, but it was not yet the dominant force in the world. France under Louis XIV was grander, more powerful, more culturally commanding. The Dutch had built a commercial empire that put England to shame. Spain still presided over vast territories in the Americas. The Ottoman Empire stretched from Vienna to the Persian Gulf. 150 years later, Britain stood at the center of the largest empire the world had ever seen, producing more industrial goods than the rest of the world combined, its navy unchallenged on every ocean, its language and law and institutions spreading to every continent. The transformation was so rapid, so thorough, so world-altering that it remains one of the most extraordinary things that has ever happened in human history. How did it happen? No single answer is adequate. But the threads, followed back far enough, lead to a particular collision of circumstance and character, of geography and institution, of accident and design, that is uniquely British and uniquely of this moment. The constitutional settlement that followed the glorious revolution of 1688 was the first essential thread. James II, Charles II brother, openly Catholic and increasingly tyrannical in his governing style, had alarmed English Protestants so thoroughly that Parliament took the extraordinary step of inviting a foreign prince, William of Orange, to invade England and replace him. William came, James fled, and the whole thing was accomplished with so little bloodshed that it earned, somewhat optimistically, the name the Glorious Revolution. What followed was a constitutional renegotiation of fundamental importance. The Bill of Rights of 1689 established that Parliament's consent was required for taxation, that standing armies could not be maintained in peacetime without parliamentary approval, that the Crown could not suspend laws on its own authority. The monarch remained powerful, but the principle that power was shared between Crown and Parliament, between King and the representatives of the propertied classes, was now embedded in law in a way it had never quite been before. This mattered enormously for what was to come. The security of property, the reliability of contracts, the confidence of merchants and investors that the rules would not be arbitrarily changed by a desperate monarch, these were the conditions in which commerce and eventually industry could flourish. Britain was becoming, however imperfectly, a country where wealth could be accumulated with some confidence that it would not simply be seized, where credit could be extended and repaid, where the machinery of a modern economy could begin to turn. The Act of Union of 1707 added another piece to the puzzle. Scotland and England, which had shared a monarch since 1603 but remained legally separate kingdoms, were formally united into the Kingdom of Great Britain. Their parliaments merged at Westminster. It was a union achieved by a mixture of persuasion, economic pressure, and what later Scottish historians would describe with considerable bitterness as bribery. Many Scots resented it. The Jacobite risings of 1715 and 1745 attempts to restore the Stuart line and, in the process, reverse the Union demonstrated just how raw the wound remained. The rising of 1745, led by Charles Edward Stuart Bonnie Prince Charlie, The young pretender came closer to succeeding than English historians have sometimes been comfortable acknowledging. The Jacobite army marched as far south as Derby before turning back, and the panic in London was real. But at Culloden in April 1746, the last pitched battle ever fought on British soil, the Jacobite cause was broken. The reprisals that followed the destruction of the clan system, the banning of Highland dress, the systematic dismantling of Gaelic culture were brutal in ways that echo still in Scottish national memory. The Union held, and a united Britain, pooling its resources and its talent and its naval power, was considerably stronger than either nation had been alone. The empire grew through a mixture of war, trade, and settlement in ways that resist any simple narrative. The slave trade was one of its foundations, and it cannot be passed over. From the mid-17th century onward, British merchants and the Royal African Company transported hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to the colonies of the Caribbean and North America, where they were forced to labor on the sugar and tobacco and cotton plantations that generated enormous wealth for British investors, merchants, and landowners. By the height of the trade in the mid-18th century, Britain was the dominant slaving nation in the world, responsible for transporting perhaps half of all the Africans taken across the Atlantic in that century. The wealth generated by this system flowed back into Britain and helped alongside other factors to capitalize the investment in infrastructure that would drive the Industrial Revolution. The great port cities of Bristol and Liverpool grew rich on the trade. Insurance companies, banks, and trading houses in London were deeply intertwined with it. The sugar islands of the Caribbean were, for much of the 18th century, considered more economically valuable than all of Britain's North American colonies combined. The abolition movement that eventually ended British participation in the slave trade, the trade itself abolished in 1807, slavery throughout the empire abolished in 1833, was one of the great moral campaigns in British history, driven by the testimony of enslaved people themselves, by Quaker activists, by the parliamentary brilliance of William Wilberforce, and by the dogged persistence of a movement that spent decades fighting against powerful economic interests before it prevailed. That it prevailed at all, and as early as it did, was genuinely remarkable. That it was necessary at all remains a fundamental part of the honest account of how Britain's wealth and power were built. The Industrial Revolution that transformed Britain between roughly 1760 and 1850 was, in its way, as significant a rupture in human history as the coming of agriculture 10,000 years before. For all of human existence up to this point, the energy available to any society was limited to what could be extracted from human and animal muscle, from wind, and from water. The steam engine developed and refined by a succession of inventors culminating in James Watt, working in Glasgow and Birmingham in the 1760s and 1770s, broke that constraint for the first time. Here was a machine that could convert the energy stored in coal into mechanical work, without limit and without fatigue, working 24 hours a day, capable of being scaled up almost indefinitely. The consequences were revolutionary in the most literal sense. Cotton mills in Lancashire, iron foundries in the Black Country, coal mines sinking deeper into the earth across South Wales and County Durham and the Scottish lowlands, all powered by steam, all producing at scales that would have seemed fantastical to any previous generation. Britain's output of iron increased tenfold between 1750 and 1800, and tenfold again in the century that followed. The railways, spreading their iron tracks across the country from the 1830s onward, shrank time and distance in ways that transformed the texture of daily life as completely as the internet would transform it a century and a half later. People moved. They moved from the countryside to the new industrial cities Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Sheffield, Glasgow in their hundreds of thousands, drawn by the wages the factories offered and pushed by an agricultural system that was itself being rationalized and mechanized in ways that left less and less room for the rural poor. By 1851, for the first time in human history, More than half the population of Britain lived in towns rather than the countryside. It was a threshold that no society had ever crossed before. The cities they built were, by any measure, extraordinary and appalling. Victorian Manchester, the shock city of its age, produced more cotton goods than the whole of France, and housed the workers who produced them in conditions of overcrowding, pollution, and squalor that reformers struggled to find language adequate to describe. The River Irwell ran with the effluent of the mills. Children worked 14-hour days in the factories. Life expectancy in the slum districts of the industrial cities was lower than almost anywhere in the pre-industrial world. Friedrich Engels, working as a young man in his family's Manchester cotton business, wrote about what he witnessed in a book that he and his friend Karl Marx would use as the foundation for a theory of history that would shape the 20th century more than almost any other idea. Britain was producing both the wealth of the modern world and the conditions that would inspire the most powerful critique of that world. And yet change was coming, slowly. The great Victorian reform movements, the campaign for the Reform Act of 1832, which began the long process of extending voting rights, the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, which lowered food prices for the poor, the Factory Acts that limited child labor, the Public Health Acts that began to clean up the cities, the expansion of elementary education represented a genuine, if always inadequate, effort to manage the social consequences of the transformation that industry had wrought. The Victorian age was an age of extraordinary contradiction, empire and reform, wealth and poverty, scientific confidence and religious anxiety, the certainty that progress was real and the nagging fear that what was being lost in the pursuit of it was irreplaceable. It produced Dickens and Darwin and Brunel and Florence Nightingale and Isambard Kingdom Brunel and Queen Victoria herself, reigning for 63 years over a country and an empire that changed beyond recognition between her coronation in 1837 and her death in 1901. At its height, the British Empire covered roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and governed roughly a quarter of its people. India, the jewel in the crown, as it was called, had been brought under direct crown rule after the Indian Mutiny of 1857. Africa had been carved up between the European powers in the scramble of the 1880s, and Britain had taken the largest share. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa were settler colonies developing their own identities and their own forms of self-government. The Royal Navy enforced a global trading order that, whatever its injustices, was also the framework within which international commerce had expanded to a degree that benefited unevenly, but genuinely people in many parts of the world. It was a structure built on enormous confidence and an enormous amount of violence and coercion that British writers of the time often preferred not to examine too closely. The confidence was not entirely unjustified. Britain had genuinely produced things of lasting value, in law and medicine and engineering and literature and political philosophy, that spread around the world alongside the gunboats and the administrators. But the violence was real, and the coercion was real, and the people on the receiving end of it experienced it with a clarity that the distance of empire made easy for those at the center to ignore. The 20th century would make that ignorance impossible to sustain. It would also bring Britain itself to the green and ancient island that had survived ice ages and invasions and plagues and civil wars and revolutions, two wars so catastrophic that the world they destroyed could never be rebuilt, and would have to be replaced with something new. That final chapter, the World Wars, the end of empire, and the Britain that emerged into the present day is the story we carry with us into the last passage of our long journey through these islands. For now, let the steam engines turn in the dock mills. Let the railway engines send their smoke across the green fields. Let the ironclads rest at anchor in Portsmouth Harbor, the largest fleet the world has ever seen. Britain stands at the summit of the world it has made. It does not yet know what that world is about to cost. The 20th century arrived in Britain with the fanfare of an empire at its zenith and departed with the quiet of a country that had survived more than almost any nation is asked to endure. In between late two world wars, the dissolution of the largest empire in history, the construction of a welfare state, waves of social transformation that remade the culture from within, and a long, searching, not always comfortable process of asking what Britain was, what it had done, and what it might yet become. It is a story that begins, as so many British stories do, in the mud. The First World War, the Great War, as those who lived through it called it, because they could not imagine anything greater or more terrible, began in August 1914 with a mood, in Britain at least, that mixed genuine patriotism with something closer to adventure. The men who volunteered in their hundreds of thousands in those early weeks did not know what they were marching toward. How could they? Nothing in human experience had prepared anyone for what industrial warfare on the Western Front would look like. The Somme, Passchendaele, Verdun, names that became, within months, synonymous with a particular vision of hell. The flooded shell craters, the barbed wire, the mud that swallowed men whole, the machine guns that cut down advancing infantry in their thousands before they had taken a dozen steps. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme alone, the 1st of July 1916, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties. It remains the bloodiest single day in the history of the British military. By the time the war ended in November 1918, nearly 1 million men from Britain and Ireland had been killed, and millions more wounded in body and mind in ways that the medicine and psychology of the time had no adequate means to address. Almost every family in the country had lost someone. Almost every village had its roll of honor, its names carved in stone outside the church or in the market square, names that can still be read today, and should be. The survivors came home to a country that had promised them a land fit for heroes and found, instead, economic depression, unemployment, and the dawning realization that the world the war had been fought to preserve was gone and could not be restored. The interwar years were a time of genuine social progress in some respects. Women over 30 received the vote in 1918, and women over 21 in 1928. After decades of suffragette campaigning that had combined peaceful lobbying with direct action and civil disobedience in ways that had shaken the political establishment profoundly, the trade union movement grew in strength. The Labour Party, founded only in 1900, became for the first time a serious contender for government. The outlines of a more equal society were beginning to be visible, even through the misery of the Depression years. But across the Channel, the consequences of the First World War were producing something darker. The humiliation of Germany under the Treaty of Versailles, the economic devastation of the Depression, the failure of liberal democracy to address the despair and resentment of populations looking for simple answers to complex problems, all of this was creating the conditions for the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy, and for a second, even more catastrophic war. Britain's response to the growing threat of Nazi Germany in the 1930s, the policy of appeasement, associated above all with Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's return from Munich in 1938 brandishing a piece of paper and promising peace for our time, has been debated ever since. Whether it was cowardly capitulation or realistic assessment of Britain's unreadiness for war, or both simultaneously, historians still argue. What is certain is that it did not work. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun. The story of Britain's war is, in its broad outlines, one of the most familiar in the national memory, familiar enough that it has become a kind of myth, polished smooth by repetition, its complicated edges worn away. The myth is not entirely wrong. The evacuation of Dunkirk in May and June of 1940, when the British Expeditionary Force was rescued from the beaches of northern France by a fleet of naval vessels and civilian boats that crossed the Channel in their hundreds, was real and remarkable. The Battle of Britain that summer, when the Royal Air Force fought the Luftwaffe for control of the skies over southern England in a contest on which the survival of the country genuinely depended, that was real, and the courage of the pilots who flew it was real. Winston Churchill's speeches delivered in a voice of such defiant, rolling grandeur that they seemed to embody something essential about the British spirit. Those were real, and they mattered, and they still do. But the myth smooths over things that deserve to be remembered clearly. The Blitz, the German bombing campaign against British cities from September 1940, killed more than 40,000 British civilians and left millions homeless. The war in the Pacific and in Burma was brutal in ways that received far less attention than the European theater. Britain's conduct in its empire during the war years was not always what the rhetoric of freedom and democracy implied. The Bengal famine of 1943, in which perhaps 2 to 3 million people died partly as a consequence of wartime policy decisions made in London, is a chapter that sits uneasily alongside the heroic narrative. The war ended in Europe in May 1945 and in the Pacific in August 1945. Britain had survived. It had not been invaded, not been occupied, not suffered the particular trauma that ran through the histories of France and Poland and the Netherlands and so many others. But it had been profoundly changed, and the world it emerged into was one in which its old position as the center of a global empire, as the dominant naval power, as the workshop of the world, was no longer available. The general election of July 1945, held before the war in the Pacific was even over, produced one of the most decisive electoral results in British history. The country that had elected Churchill as its wartime leader turned, with apparently brutal ingratitude, and voted him out of office by a landslide. It was not, in fact, ingratitude. It was a clear-eyed decision that the qualities needed to win a war were not the same qualities needed to build a peacetime society, and that the society Britain wanted to build was different from the one it had had before. The Labour government of Clement Attlee set about building it with a speed and ambition that still astonishes. The National Health Service, the institution that, more than any other, defines the particular social contract that post-war Britain made with itself, was founded in 1948, offering for the first time healthcare free at the point of need to every person in the country regardless of their ability to pay. The welfare state was extended to cover unemployment, poverty, and old age in ways that had never existed before. Key industries were nationalized. The grammar school system was expanded to give working-class children access to the kind of education that had previously been the preserve of those who could pay for it. It was an extraordinary 5 years, and it created the framework imperfect, contested, perpetually underfunded, perpetually argued over within which British public life has been conducted ever since. The empire dissolved with a speed that surprised almost everyone. India, the jewel in the crown, the linchpin of the whole imperial project, became independent in August 1947, partitioned into the new nations of India and Pakistan in a process accompanied by one of the largest forced migrations in human history and by communal violence that killed hundreds of thousands of people. The partition was a catastrophe, and the British role in the conditions that produced it is part of the honest account of how decolonization happened. Country after country followed through the 1950s and 1960s in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific. Some transitions were peaceful. Others, Kenya, Malaya, Cyprus, Aden, involved campaigns of counterinsurgency whose methods were sometimes brutal and whose history Britain has been slow to fully reckon with. The process was cold, with characteristic British understatement. The wind of change, a phrase used by Harold Macmillan in a speech in South Africa in 1960, acknowledging that the age of empire was over and that a new relationship between Britain and the world it had shaped was necessary. The Suez Crisis of 1956 made the new reality undeniable. When Britain and France, in collusion with Israel, attempted to seize the Suez Canal from Egypt by force, the United States refused to support them and forced a humiliating withdrawal. It was the moment that demonstrated, beyond any possibility of denial, that Britain was no longer a great power in the old sense, that its room for independent action in the world was now constrained by the decisions of others, primarily the Americans, whose alliance was essential and whose patience had limits. Britain retreated, and thought about what it was. The decades that followed were ones of genuine difficulty and genuine reinvention. The economic troubles of the 1960s and 1970s, the recurring crises, the industrial disputes, the sense of a country failing to adapt to a world in which its old industrial advantages had eroded and its competitors had rebuilt, produced a social tension that surfaced in strikes and power cuts, and the three-day week and the winter of discontent of 1978 and 1979. When rubbish piled up in the streets and the dead went unburied, and the country seemed, to many observers, to be in a state of irreversible decline. Margaret Thatcher's election in 1979 was the response to that sense of crisis, a decisive, controversial, in many ways brutal transformation of the economic and social settlement that had governed Britain since 1945. Manufacturing declined. The trade unions were broken. Financial services expanded. The gap between rich and poor widened. And the country that emerged from the Thatcher years was more dynamic in some ways and more divided in others than the country that had entered them. Through all of this, Britain was also becoming something genuinely new in its population and its culture. The Windrush generation that arrived from the Caribbean from 1948 onward, invited to help rebuild a country short of labor, welcomed by some and met with discrimination and hostility by others, was the beginning of a transformation that continued through decades of immigration from South Asia, from East Africa, from Hong Kong, from Eastern Europe, from every part of the world. The Britain of the early 21st century was more diverse in its population, its food, its music, its religion, and its daily life than at any previous point in its history. It was also, in many ways, still working out what that diversity meant and how to honor it. And so we arrive, at last, at the present, or as close to it as a long history can reach. Britain today is a country of extraordinary complexity, carrying within itself the accumulated weight of all the centuries we have traveled through tonight. The chalk downs where Neolithic farmers once built their long barrows. The Roman roads still running straight beneath the tarmac of the A-roads. The Norman churches in 10,000 English villages. The place names that are still Old English, still Old Norse, still Welsh and Cornish and Gaelic in the places where those languages were spoken and are sometimes spoken still. It is a country that has been shaped by every people who ever came to it: the Celts and the Romans, the Saxons and the Vikings, the Normans and the Huguenots and the Jews and the people of the Caribbean and South Asia and everywhere else, and that carries all of those layers simultaneously, not always comfortably, but genuinely, in the faces of its people and the cadences of its speech, in the particular way it has always managed to absorb change while insisting, with some justice, that something essential has remained the same. What has remained the same is harder to name than to feel. Something to do with the landscape, the green fields and the gray skies and the light on the sea at the end of a long day. Something to do with a particular habit of mind, skeptical of grand claims, suspicious of enthusiasm, devoted to fairness in a way that is sincere even when it falls short. Something to do with the knowledge, accumulated across all these centuries, that the island has endured, that whatever came to the ice, the invasions, the plagues, the wars, the revolutions it endured, and that endurance, quiet and stubborn and utterly unspectacular, is perhaps the deepest thing in the story. We began, in the first hours of this journey, with a land of ancient forests and glacial ice, with the first human footprints pressed into mud that would harden into the fossil record of a world before writing, before cities, before any of the things we mean when we say history. We have traveled through 10,000 years of it, through stone and bronze and iron, through Roman roads and Saxon mead halls, through Norman castles and Tudor palaces, through plague and civil war and industrial revolution and global empire and 2 world wars and the long, careful work of building something better from the ruins. It is a long story. It is not a simple one. It contains things to be proud of and things to be ashamed of, and a great deal that is simply human, neither heroic nor villainous, but the ordinary texture of people trying to live their lives with whatever tools and understanding their moment gave them. Britain is still that ancient land, still that island at the edge of the world, still being shaped by the water and the wind and by the endless human effort to make something lasting from the brief time we are given. Hey, the story is not over. It never is. This concludes the video. Thanks for watching. Sleep well. Good night.